I'm going to tell you a secret that our government doesn't really want many people knowing. The American taxpayers have spent over $10 billion to store spent nuclear fuel, fuel that contains enough energy to power our country for more than 100 years. We're not using it, we're storing it, and we're adding $500 million to that bill every year. See, I work in spent nuclear fuel management for a living. In fact, I actually work for the company that's building a technology to end this crisis. But before I show you what we're building, I need to tell you how we got here, because there are people that benefit from keeping that fuel on these concrete pads, and they've been in Washington a lot longer than I have. My name is J.R. Majewski. I spent 23 years working inside the American nuclear power industry, not writing about it or studying it. I studied it a little bit, but been inside it, been on the floor. I ran and worked in refueling outages. I've stood next to the dry casks that I'm going to tell you about today. But before we go any further, I need you to know that this video doesn't represent my employer's views. It represents what I feel is my perspective after 23 years on the inside, and what it looks like when you finally decide to say things out loud. Well, let's get started, shall we? Now, most people think Jimmy Carter banned nuclear fuel recycling, and that's mostly true. But the story starts a little bit earlier. In 1976, President Gerald Ford issued a presidential directive indefinitely suspending commercial reprocessing and recycling of plutonium. And his reason was specific. In 1974, India became the first country to test a nuclear weapon since the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, and they did it using reprocessing technology. And Ford's fear was straightforward. If you can separate plutonium from spent nuclear fuel, you have a pathway to a bomb. And then on April 7th of 1977, Jimmy Carter formalized that ban because he wanted to set a moral example to the world. His example was that the United States would voluntarily walk away from this technology in the hopes that others would follow. I want to be honest about this. In 1977, that was a defensible call. The proliferation concern was real. But I'm not here to relitigate Jimmy Carter. I'm ready to tell you what happened afterwards. See, there was a reprocessing facility already being built in Barnwell, South Carolina. Allied Chemical had partially constructed the facility. It was designed to reprocess 1,500 metric tons of spent fuel per year. The ban killed it before it ever opened. That's the first domino. Then in 1981, Ronald Reagan lifted the ban as part of a broader deregulation push. It was the right call, but by then, the industry had already moved on. The economics had shifted. The regulatory environment had shifted. And so no one ended up building a reprocessing facility. But the point is, Reagan opened the door, and nobody walked through it. And something that people don't realize is that nuclear plants were never designed to permanently store their spent fuel, not on site. They have spent fuel pools, but they're meant to be temporary. They provide a few years of cooling while the fuel waits to go off site for reprocessing, but unfortunately, reprocessing just never came, and their pools started to fill up. So utilities began re-racking, and that's packing the fuel more tightly in their pools to squeeze in more assemblies. And that brought them time, but it didn't bring a solution. And because of this, the industry had to invent a new normal. And that was dry cask storage. Now, I've stood next to these things. They're huge. I've managed these programs at multiple facilities across the world. These dry cask storage containers, well, they're stainless steel canisters that get welded shut and placed inside of a concrete or steel outer shell, and then they get set on a concrete pad. Now, these things work. They have passive cooling, no pumps, no fans, no active systems. They're safe. They emit less radiation than a chest x-ray. But the problem is they were never meant to be permanent. And right now, we have approximately 86,000 metric tons of spent nuclear fuel sitting in dry cask and fuel pools at 75 sites across 33 states. And that number continues to grow by about 2,000 metric tons every year. And here's where the taxpayer comes in. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, that policy made a legal promise. The Department of Energy would take ownership of commercial spent nuclear fuel beginning in 1998. That plan was supposed to be Yucca Mountain. Yucca Mountain was a permanent repository that was carved into a Nevada mountain, but the DOE didn't meet their deadline. Yucca Mountain never opened. all because Congress fought over it for 4 decades. And plus, Nevada didn't want it. Other states didn't want to be next. Basically, the politics never resolved themselves. So the utilities had to act again. And they sued. And they won. And as a result, the federal government now paid out over $10.6 billion in legal settlements, all for failing to take the fuel. And guess what? We're still paying approximately $500 million every year because there's an ongoing liability. $500 million every year. This is all for a problem that has a solution. Now, I want to introduce you to two companies, Holtec International and Orano. Now, these aren't household names because they're not supposed to be. They operate in a space that most Americans have never thought about. They operate in the management, the storage, and eventual disposition of spent nuclear fuel in the U.S. They're the two dominant players. Dry cask systems, on-site storage contracts, consolidated interim storage proposals. It all goes through them, and they have no meaningful competition. Hell, Orano is owned by the French government. And this is as close to a monopoly as you'll find in American energy. I know these companies. I didn't read about them. I've worked for them, both of them. And if you think about what their business model requires, well, revenue flows as long as spent fuel sits in storage. Every metric ton of fuel that gets recycled is a metric ton that they no longer get to manage. And every year, the status quo continues. It's another year of contracts, another year of revenue, another year of political relevance in Washington. They have no financial incentive to solve this problem because their business model requires the problem to continue. These companies have a lot of influence in Washington. They donate to campaigns on both sides of the aisle, and they donate to the same Congress that was supposed to solve the problem with Yucca Mountain. Same Congress that's never passed meaningful legislation. Now, I'm not alleging a crime here because this is just how Washington works. It's all legal. I mean, businesses protect their revenue stream, and they do that by funding the campaigns that write the policy that protects their revenue stream. And again, I've worked inside the industry and I've saw this. It's not a theory. But let me give you 5 reasons why what I just described isn't just a policy failure, but it's something that's indefensible. First, the spent fuel sitting in dry cask around the country, well, it contains more than 100 years worth of energy for the U.S., and we're paying to store it. We're guarding it around the clock. But at the same time, we're importing fresh uranium from foreign nations, all to replace what we already have. We're paying to store our own fuel supply. Now, in May 2024, Congress passed and President Biden signed the Prohibiting Russian Uranium Act, and that ban went into effect in August of 24. Well, there's waivers through January of 2028, but they expire after that completely. And here's a problem with that. Russia controls about 44% of global uranium enrichment, and we just banned their product. So where are we going to get enriched uranium? Kazakhstan? I mean, they're the single largest foreign source of uranium for American reactors, but they share 4,750 miles worth of border with Russia, and they've been in Moscow's pocket for decades. Now, we banned Russian uranium and became dependent on a nation that Russia could pressure or influence on any given morning. And meanwhile, 86,000 tons we've already paid for, sitting on pads across the country. We have the fuel. We're just choosing not to use it. But we're calling this a national security strategy. Sure. Second, one of the most persistent myths about nuclear fuel recycling is that it creates more waste, but it doesn't. It actually reduces it dramatically. The recycling process extracts the usable energy from spent fuel, and most of what is in those casks is still usable, about 96%. What remains after recycling is a fraction of that volume. The long-lived radioactive elements that make permanent storage so complicated are the ones that get burned in the recycling process. We're not eliminating a waste problem, we're just streamlining recycling and shrinking it to a size that's actually manageable. Third, the Department of Energy still owns all of this waste, which means you and I own it. And right now, you and I are paying $500 million a year to manage it. And we've already paid $10.6 billion in legal settlements, all because the government failed to take it. That liability doesn't have an end date. As long as the fuel sits there, the clock runs. A recycling program doesn't just solve the energy problem, it eliminates a current liability that comes back every year. Actually, it compounds every year. Fourth, every countries are doing this. France recycles their nuclear fuel. Russia recycles. China recycles. The UK recycles. Japan is about to open a reprocessing facility in Rakacho. Every major nation on the earth has moved forward on this. The US invented commercial nuclear power. We built the first reactor. We trained all their engineers. We wrote the textbooks that the rest of the world studied for this. But today we're the outlier. We are the country that stores what everyone else is recycling. We're falling behind nations that we taught the technology to because Congress can't agree on a hole in the ground in Nevada. Now, I got to go back to Carter and give his argument its full due because I think it deserves it. The proliferation concern wasn't abstract. The dominant reprocessing technology at the time, and still today in most of the world, is called Purex, plutonium-uranium reduction extraction. It's a process that chemically separates plutonium from spent fuel in a relatively pure form. Now, that plutonium can become a weapon if it's in the wrong hands. That concern is legitimate. I'm not going to dismiss it. But what Carter wouldn't have known is that the technology that's being developed today doesn't separate the plutonium. It keeps the waste stream mixed. The plutonium never exists in an isolated, weapons-usable form. The pathway that Carter was trying to close was not available in this process because the process was specifically designed to eliminate it. That's the only sentence you need. The plutonium is never separated. There's no weapons pathway. That is the argument that should have ended this debate years ago, but it hasn't. Because maybe the debate was, never about proliferation. Because something has changed in the past 3 years. And that change is bigger than any policy decision in Washington. Artificial intelligence. It requires enormous amounts of power. Data centers are being built at a pace that the American grid was never designed to support. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta. Every major tech company has signed a nuclear power purchase agreement because they need carbon-free, always-on baseload power. There's only one technology that delivers that at scale, and it's nuclear. Folks, the nuclear renaissance isn't coming. It's here. But it's being driven not by government policy, but by the electricity demands of the most powerful companies in the world. Now, the math that nobody wants to talk about is that the renaissance requires fuel. And again, we've banned Russian uranium. We're dependent on Kazakhstan for the largest share of our imports. We don't have domestic enrichment capacity. Being rebuilt, but it takes years. New mines take years. New enrichment facilities take years. And that demand, though, the curve's going up. And the supply curve isn't going to be able to keep up on fresh uranium imported alone. And every policymaker who understands the nuclear fuel cycle, and there's not many of them, they know this. But the numbers, they don't work. Not cleanly. But they do work if we recycle the fuel we have and add that to the equation. Now, if you want to understand where this fuel comes from before it even reaches a dry cask, I broke down the entire uranium fuel cycle in one of my videos. I'll put the link up on the screen. This technology is not coming because Washington got smart. Washington hasn't gotten smart. The same dynamics that kept Yucca Mountain closed for 40 years still exist today. The same influence, the same campaign money, the same institutional inertia, still there. This technology is coming because the grid is demanding it, and we have no other option. Electricity demand from AI alone is going to force a reckoning with spent fuel, a reckoning that 4 decades of congressional debate never could produce. The fuel is already here, folks. It's sitting in dry cask at 75 sites across 33 states. We paid to generate it, and we're paying to store it. We've been told for 50 years that we can't use it, based on a policy before this technology never existed, all aimed at a risk this technology eliminates. Again, I work in this space. I know what's being built. I know what the fuel cycle looks like from the inside, and I can tell you the only question left, not whether America recycles spent nuclear fuel, it's whether we do it in time.